Thanks, Shelley. Okay, thank you very much, Denise, for that extra information. I'm also going to ask for something quite daring. Would all of you please turn your cameras on once we get started?
Here comes Grace.
Great. Thank you, Philip.
We've got about 3 or 4 folks that have added in their information. Thanks, Philip, as Andy said. If there are others who, are we missing some team folks? Brenda, how about you? If you want to throw in how you're thinking about.
I'm typing in now.
Thank you, ma'am.
All right, we're going to start. I'm giving you the 1 minute signal. We're going to start in 1 minute. So please type into the chat your information. The questions are on the screen in front of you. And would you also please turn your cameras on once we get started? Welcome to everybody. Hello, Laura. Welcome. It's nice to see a fellow Californian on the serve. I'm up in the Bay Area, but have family all over the Valley and particularly in Northridge. So I'm happy to have your name and to have a chance to spend time with you. Okay. Hello, Grace. We're really happy you're here. And why don't we get started? And Grace, are you agreeable to getting started?
Yes.
Great.
All right, I just want to welcome everybody. For those of you who I have not met, I'm Ann Lotch. I'm the Justice System Coordinator at NCAL and helping to get things started today. I think that I don't see Laura Ivkovich. Is that correct, Grace? She's not
That's
gonna be
correct.
Okay. Is there anything you wanted to say before I introduce Candy?
No, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So again, please use the chat. Kylan and I will be, even though she is not here, it's my understanding she may be taking a look at the chat. Otherwise, I will keep an eye on it. So if you have questions, please put them in there. We will have one poll for you to respond to. Otherwise, I think that's about it. I will start by introducing Candy Heisler, even though she is the quintessential person who needs no introduction. Candy Heisler served as an assistant district attorney in San Francisco for over 25 years, including 10 years as the head of the domestic violence unit. A graduate of University of California's Hastings College of Law. She was an assistant adjunct professor there for over 20 years. She now trains and consults for a variety of organizations, including NCAL, every chance we can get her, and also government entities in the areas of elder abuse and domestic violence. She has published articles and designed curricula on elder abuse and domestic violence for judges, law enforcement, protective services workers, medical personnel, and prosecutors. She co-authored Elder Abuse Detection and Intervention, a multidisciplinary approach, and the chapter Elder Abuse in the book Victims of Crime. She created the NAPSA core competency model on working with the criminal justice system. And she was part of an OVC funded grant on poly-victimization in later life and was a member of the technical assistance team for the NAPSA Resource Center grant. And she was awarded the 2016 NAPSA Collaboration Award. So that's a whole lot. I'm happy to be here to support you today, Candy, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Anne. Thank you so much, Grace, and hello to everybody. I hope to make some new friends today. I understand Laura has just joined us, so who would like to introduce Laura?
I don't need introduction. That's okay. I can just say hello, but thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm sorry, I was on another webinar, another Zoom meeting. And so I had to jump off of that, and I'm going to have to jump off this one after I say hello and welcome to everyone, especially in light of World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, and all the efforts and dedication and work spent, working around these issues, and then celebrating and commemorating this week. I also just learned that Friday is a new federal holiday. So there's a lot to celebrate this week. And I just want to say thank you to each and every one for your hard work, your dedication, for your drive and enthusiasm in the work that you do. We take great pride in knowing that we have direct service work that we're able to fund, as well as programs that think through how they might want to address the needs of crime victims in the future and make policy changes and training and educating allied professionals and other colleagues who need to know about the plight of older victims of abuse and financial exploitation. So thank you all for your extra efforts this week. I don't know if you were able to see the video of our acting director as she was on YouTube on the 15th, but if not, we hope that you'll be able to go to OVC's website to take a look at that. But I want to thank you on behalf of the Office for Victims of Crime for all that you do. And I'll just turn it back to Candy and anybody else who is also leading this webinar. Thank you very much for your efforts as well. Take care.
Thank you, Laura. So glad you were able to stop by and say those kind and welcoming words. All right, I'm a little uncomfortable disclaiming about what I'm about to talk about, but here it is. As you have seen many times before, The opinions, findings, and conclusions and recommendations that I may offer or you may suggest do not represent the official position or policies of the Department of Justice. A word as we get started. There is incredible expertise among you who are part of this call. And taking that into account, it made no sense for me to create a lecture, nor did the topic lend itself to that. So I see this as an informal session. Your comments are going to be both sought and welcome. And the way this is going to unfold is I'll introduce an area, I'll make some general comments or raise some questions. I then will invite you to describe if you have experiences that are relevant to what we're discussing at that moment. I'm going to ask you to add them either by unmuting yourself and speaking or by typing in the chat. I'll follow those for each of the 3 sections with just a couple of general closing ideas, and then we'll move on to the next topic. Under no conditions would I ever attempt to tell this group what to do or how to do it. On a different note, it makes no sense to do that because your communities are so different, and each of you is going to navigate a course as you approach the subject of where do I find the cases that our team is going to consult about. So in terms of our learning objectives, this is what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about how case selection criteria can act as an obstacle. We're going to talk about the relationship between review processes and team membership. And we're going to think about ways you may want to think about changing or revising or updating your existing processes to increase your success in getting the right cases in front of your team. On that note, Anne, if you'd please launch the poll, although I think I kind of know some of the answers, but let's quickly answer these questions. We're only going to give you a few seconds. Okay, I think we have about 3 or 4 seconds and we're going to close this. Okay, Anne, you could close the poll out. So as I suspected, we are heavily weighted towards existing teams that have been have been doing work for at least a year. If I had said how many of you are old timers and have been doing this for 5 or more years, we'd have had quite a number of you in that category too. But there also are about a third of you who are new and are getting settled and getting set up. And I'm hoping that we can draw from the experiences, maybe some of the frustrations and the successes that you have found as you have worked to help everybody come up with some new ideas and new approaches. So let me close the poll. All right, so keeping you working, which means I'm doing less talking, how about quickly listing some of the barriers that you have already encountered, and if you have found effective solutions, would you please include those? Please put your ideas in the chat. And it goes without saying, I think that if your team, if some of the folks here don't actually bring cases to the table, that if you have seen barriers, please mention them, but it's not expected that you will have to respond to this. So Rebecca talks about attendees not wanting to staff a case, but wanting updates on investigations. And a solution that her team has tried has been to ask all members to provide a case summary before diving into questions and discussions. Anne or Kylin or Grace, if there are other messages in the chat, would you please share them?
And I can do those. In additional, Laura Stein says barriers not wanting to bring the cases to the table because the organizations feel that they can handle them themselves until they can't. And so I think that's something that folks see regularly. Jelly adds, continuous reminders to submit cases have been helpful. Cold calling members to ask if they have cases to discuss. Some things that have worked, but it's a continuing challenge. Lindsay points out that there are different interpretations about the term complex in regards to what that means for complex cases of elder abuse. Philip adds the barriers with case managers buying into the MDT. I think it's again maybe that sharing of resources and time and issues. Linda points out that they send meeting reminders a week before the meeting every month, and also send the form to help people submit a case prior to the meetings. I think I got them all.
Well, thank you.
that.
These are really helpful and thoughtful. I think it makes this point that we started with, that is finding cases to keep the team busy and engaged, is not simply opening your doors and say, bring them on. There's real work involved, and it's not a one-time process. It's a continuing process. Some of you have found and suggested approaches that may keep this in front of people and get them thinking about how can this process help me. So I want to just take a moment and step back and tell you sort of the backdrop to why I think I was invited to present this webinar. Some of you all will already know what I'm about to say because you helped. But some months ago, I was invited to do a survey about why MDTs like yours may have difficulty finding sufficient and appropriate cases for teams to review. And once again, thank you to those of you who participated. With that assignment, I interviewed quite a number of team facilitators around the country, including several of you here. I reviewed existing memorandum of understanding, procedures, and approaches. I did a lit review, and then I pulled together forms and what you taught me from those many interviews into a report. You're not going to be forced to look at those many pages of report, but staff is graciously summarizing that material and has those suggested forms for approach. And they will be providing that information to you in a much more pleasant way, in a much more concise way after this webinar. I think it's also important as we really dive into the session to acknowledge that the last year and months have been some of the most difficult anybody has ever gone through. And that is certainly true of MDTs across the country. And some teams have really struggled to get started, to build momentum, to keep members engaged, and to find cases. Technology has certainly increased access to one another in new and different ways other than face-to-face meetings. But just the act of doing this work has been incredibly complex. So what I learned by the study that I did is that there's no formula for finding sufficient cases for the team to consult on, but some of the themes included looking at case review criteria, team membership, processes, and then making sure that the work of the team was understood by those who might be bringing cases. And so that's going to be our outline of what we're going to look at over the next little while. Let's turn first to case review criteria. And it goes, I think it's pretty apparent that case review criteria really are the markers or gatekeepers for what the team is able to do. And whatever your criteria are, unless you say we will take anything and everything, and none of you do that, you are going to be necessarily excluding something that might benefit from an MDT case consultation process. And it's also fair to say that by definition, that if your goal is risk reduction, some of the cases you have excluded from your criteria might well also be those that would benefit from expanded criteria. Having said that, there are reasons that teams limit what they review, including sources of funding, which came up repeatedly when I talked to different communities as to what they did and what they didn't do. And so thinking about case review criteria seems like an important place to start. So this is the part where I'm going to to offer some questions for you to analyze and maybe take back to your team as you think about, is this the best, do we have the best criteria that we can given our limitations or our requirements? So just starting with, how do you pick cases? How did you come up with your criteria? Did you decide, and some communities have decided that we are simply going to look at cases that focus on the work of a single system? Some communities I talk to, that is prosecution really drives choices. In others, it's adult protective services that really drives the kinds of cases that get reviewed. But if those are your parameters, you're limiting yourself, of course. Some communities use only active cases, meaning ones that are currently being reviewed either for potential prosecution or for service delivery. Others only look at closed cases because you avoid problems of prosecutor disclosures of confidential information that might otherwise be required. Some communities say we're taking a more broad view and we will look at whatever team members view as complex or difficult and would benefit from coordination across systems. Some teams exclude self-neglect while others include it. And so there are a variety of criteria that communities have arrived at. None of these are wrong. None of these are the only way to do it. But what I hope I'm encouraging you to do as you think about them is to recognize the implications of your decisions. For example, if, as many communities do, you require that Adult Protective Services has either opened an investigation or has actually found an allegation of abuse to be founded or sustained, then think about, what does APS actually handle in your jurisdiction? Some jurisdictions, APS only handles cases where the elder is in the community, your community. even if they've only left temporarily and gone to a family member while sort of the dust is settling. Others don't intervene if the client is in a hospital or long-term care facility, either because they're perceived as being in a safe environment or because APS in that jurisdiction doesn't have authority to investigate when the person is in such a facility. APS may not handle all forms of abuse or exploitation, and across the country, they use varying standards before they can confirm an allegation. While many use the very lowest civil standard of preponderance, more likely than not, there are jurisdictions that use a much higher standard of clear and convincing evidence. And so that in and of itself may limit the cases that you are able to see. And be aware that APS does not necessarily investigate all potentially criminal conduct that occurs to older or vulnerable adults. So if that is your primary criteria, consider what are you missing. Self-neglect, there may be reasons to exclude self-neglect, including that your membership really doesn't include the kind of expertise that you need to really effectively intervene and understand these complexities. But I would only ask you to consider, are you inquiring if the reason this person is self-neglecting is an outcome of a criminal victimization, if criminal focus is the way you're looking at cases? Many times that question is never explored, so you'll never know. So those are just some ideas to get you thinking. And this is where I'm going to ask you either to put in the chat or just unmute yourself and share a few thoughts that you may have for enhancing case selection criteria or some additional responses beyond those you've already offered that could help other communities address case selection issues. And once again, I'm going to turn to the folks who are keeping an eye on the chat or who can see everyone in the room. I cannot, I apologize, so that you get everybody given a chance to speak. Does anyone want to just jump in? Shelley, jump in, please.
Yeah, I thought it would just be easier.
Yes.
So the MDTs that I am working with, I tried to do more of a case selection criteria with them, but it kind of has disintegrated into just bring a case. Like it's such a challenge to get them to bring any case that I don't even care what case they bring. Just bring a case that we can talk about.
I actually think there's value in that, because I think what could come out of it is they have the experience of seeing that there's benefit to them and to their clients. If you find, oh, and I know you'd hate this problem, that you have too many cases at some point, you can always dial back and then start establishing narrower criteria. But I think those are some great ideas. Anybody else jumped in?
Laura Stein says in California, in San Fernando, in Santa Clara Valley, eligibility is 60 plus any detectable sign of elder abuse and lives in their service planning area.
Yeah.
One thing in Denver is we started also staffing housing exploitation, because we found that in so many cases where there was financial exploitation, our housing market is so awful here that if we knew about the housing exploitation, the scratch beneath the surface, we found that there was typically what we most often found were financial exploitation and neglect.
And I suspect a self-neglect case could similarly expose those other kinds of underlying abuse that are lurking just below the surface. So there's another great idea, is to expand how you define your terms, to think about cases that may be doorways to what you're expecting to look at. Lisa, did we cut you off while you were talking about?
No, it was fine, but Philip added in, which I think goes along with what Linda was saying, to review cases that have that multi-layered abuse component and involves various agencies within their current or past involvement. So I think that's another way at making sure you're bringing in other groups and agencies. Rebecca says that they've never staffed closed cases before, but she thinks that it would be helpful to review some of those to see if there are things that the team could learn. Thinking about that almost like a quality review. This is closed, but what could we have picked up on that we missed? Now knowing what we know, how could we do that? And Shelley's jumping back in to say that they've brought the MVP members, they have had them provide case updates on cases that they've previously brought. Helps to know if the suggestions that were helpful, because if they weren't, they don't want to keep making the same suggestions and providing, redundant information.
Thank you all.
Cut me off. You're good.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No, Linda's trying to apologize too. It's all good. Y'all know I'll keep talking.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Some great ideas. And that's got our conversation started, and we're starting to think of some maybe solutions or approaches. Let's now, just some ideas that had occurred to me based on my experience and also the study that I did, is making sure everyone understands the criteria if you have them. Thinking about, should you be doing education and outreach or preparing materials that can be disseminated broadly about the team and getting them to the right places. And periodically looking at your criteria to figure out, are they still relevant? If one of the reasons you're choosing the criteria have to do with funding sources and or grant requirements, consider if there would be another source of funding that could allow you to expand what you're doing and you could cobble together to support the team's work. Or is there another team operating in your community that handles those cases and where you might have a division of labor or might coordinate together? On that note, let's talk about team membership. And I think about this as you can do what you are and probably not really much beyond that. And what I learned is who's on the team really directs everything. So the experience that I had was some of the areas that teams most struggled with were who was not at the table. So some teams, for various reasons, only include governmental agencies. And there could be good legal reasons to do that in different communities. That's beyond our discussion today, unless there's a specific question about it. But if you're limiting yourself to governmental agencies, how does your team deal with cases in which you may need emergency housing, or you may need to pursue legal action or a guardianship, or you may need to accomplish an eviction if you're only doing governmental entities? Some do governmental entities and then add legal services programs, but please understand, not all legal services programs are able to provide the same extent of services. Some are very narrow in what cases they handle, and others have additional sources of funding and can handle many more. And you just have to know what are the parameters of what your members are able to do. One of the things that kept coming up in this and an earlier survey that I did was the need for civil legal expertise. And some teams didn't have legal services programs, or as I've already mentioned, had programs that were much narrower than the kinds of cases they were dealing with, which included things like reverse mortgages, annuities, real estate, undoing trusts, and the like. And they really had no one who had the needed expertise. So where do you find that? And how do you enhance your team? Specialized other expertise. Now, many of you, if not all of you, are lucky enough to have enhanced MDTs. So you do have or may have access to things like medical or cognitive or accounting expertise, but that may not be true for everyone. And the amount of involvement of those kinds of professionals may be limited by budgets. So thinking about what are the limitations that necessarily follow by your membership. I think it's an important concept to consider. Does your team reflect your community? And if, once again, if you're only doing if you're only doing governmental agencies, or you're only doing certain parts of the community that are easy to access, think about who you're not able to serve. So additional sources of cases are entities and organizations that serve diverse populations and communities in your service areas. Equally importantly, they will provide a cultural lens for understanding how this community thinks about abuse and addresses it, and what kind of remedies they may be willing to accept. It will also provide a way for you to enhance the community's trust in what you're doing, and they may act as a conduit to culturally appropriate resources that are otherwise not available. So I think this is something, it's more than simply saying we serve diverse populations. It's really making sure that you include representatives who represent those communities. It's also important to think about the relationships within the team. One of the things that I have seen on a variety of teams is not everybody feels necessarily welcome, and more importantly, doesn't feel valued or equal. Some members don't feel that their time is well spent. And that arises because sometimes teams don't allow everyone to present or to bring cases forward. There can be inherent power imbalances, either based on personality or based on degrees. So if your team has, and I'll use this as an example, people who have advanced doctoral degrees or have a lot of perceived power within the community, how do they interact with people who may not share those degrees but bring really important firsthand experience and direct services experience? Is there a process to even recognize those imbalances, let alone to address them? And do you have a conflict resolution process? Conflict is normal. It can even be healthy, but you have to have a way so it doesn't derail your work. How about members? Is everyone invested in the work? Once again, why? Why or why not? Personalities can play a really big role and be incredibly toxic, but sometimes it's agency barriers, and some of this is reflective of some of the comments in the chat. It may be legal restrictions that represent barriers, such as confidentiality or needing client consent, realizing I'm not talking about your members as clients, but the people whose cases you are reviewing as agency clients. This is not a conversation about confidentiality. You've had such a conversation already, but it's just to bring it to the fore. And agency barriers can be real. One of the barriers that I have certainly witnessed is changes of administrations in MOU partners. And so there was very gung-ho involvement and commitment to the process when the MOU was signed. But that person, that leader, has moved on or been voted out of office. There's someone new and no one has really tried to engage them. And right now, this isn't on their radar. That can kill that agency's involvement really quickly. The other thing is thinking about how you do review cases and thinking about how do we restrict information about names, about exact details that really don't require that level of description in how a case is presented. It might mean using a case intake facilitator who really meets with the team that wants to present the case, helps them put together how they're going to present and talks about how do you present, for example, the presenting problem in a sentence without all kinds of history that may reveal who we're really talking about. Let me stop for a moment and again, ask you what kinds of ideas do you have or experiences do you have that could help with some of the issues around membership?
This is y'all's turn to talk.
I know
I
one of
know
the,
there are some concerns because I saw folks nodding their heads when I was talking about some of it. Shelley, what were you going to say?
oh, I was gonna say, one of the things that I know when I started with my MDTs, I had some good ideas about who they should add to their team, but because it is their team, it really needed to come from them. And so a lot of that came out in the SWOT analysis. That some of the weaknesses is they didn't have somebody to address civil legal issues, that they didn't have somebody from the hospital social work department, they didn't have somebody. And so it was better having them have the ownership over who to reach out to ask for participation versus me saying, you have gaps here, 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 and here.
It's a really important point. Another way, especially with a newly formed team, is to do a few practice cases rather than practicing on real cases, and to see if the discussion again bubbles out who's missing and who it would be helpful to have aboard. Any other thoughts?
I can share with our team, it's just having, sometimes they feel too many people at the table. We have a lot of disciplines, none that cross over, but we're still missing people. But having a team that there's 13 different organizations, and I feel like there's still missing. So it's hard to have that many organizations all at the table.
It's a fair point. I think I may have a thought on the next slide for that. So is there anyone else who wants to jump in before I move us along?
Candy, Brenda mentioned we have an ongoing member recruitment. I asked current members if there's anyone we need to bring together.
Excellent, excellent. All right. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of these things. One of the ways that you can keep membership reasonable is to sort of have full-time members who come to every meeting, sort of your core, and then having as needed members. Now, the key here is to make sure that the as needed members feel as valued as the core members, but it may be a way as you see cases ahead of time. Now, it does mean you need to see what's on the agenda to say to certain groups, this meeting really is not going to have anything, we're not going to be discussing anything that might affect the work you can help us with. So if you'd like to if you can do something else with the hour and a half that we would otherwise meet, feel free to do that. One of the places where I have seen this used, well, I'm going to give you 2 examples. So one of the teams that I talked with was asking their core members to attend every meeting, which was roughly every week or every other week. And what they quickly found is that they were doing a lot of complex cases that had no law enforcement issues in them. And the effect was law enforcement was losing interest and saying, you don't need us, you're wasting our time. So they moved to an as needed model so that the case coordinator reviewed the cases for the next session. And if it was 3, as examples, cases that were really about community services, and really there wasn't much that was likely to involve law enforcement, would say, here's what's on if you don't want to attend this meeting. Promise you're going to attend the ones where I ask you to come. But they moved to a model like that. Another community found that they addressed the problem by sort of creating 2 different MDTs. One that really had core members and looked at more criminal justice APS overlap cases. And then another one that met on alternating weeks that was more community-based, where complex service problems were discussed. And so core members who didn't feel they had anything to add to those meetings just did not appear. I think the other area to be careful about is everybody's got to be trained on the MDT, whether they're full-time or as needed. And somebody needs to think about what are the potential conflicts of interest. And this comes up when you bring in private professionals as examples. So if you're going to bring in civil legal, for example, is the expectation they have is we're coming because we're going to get to cherry pick cases? That's a conflict of interest. Is the expectation clearly laid out in an MOU that you will not be referred the cases that we discuss here, but we value your expertise, and this is some of the way you can serve your community? Then we have things we can do. So to the person who said, we've grown like Topsy and have all the wrong people at the table or too many people to really work, I would suggest thinking about as needed members. To the folks who are saying, but if we reach out to some of these professionals, we're concerned about what could happen. Here's another way to think about approaching bringing in other talent. And in talking with many of the communities, they identified some members they had added over time who had really been benefit added. And so I've listed some of those members in case you're thinking there may be folks we need but haven't thought about. Here's a place that perhaps you might start of value added. I will also say that the agencies or the MDTs that have added some of these folks often have these folks on an as needed basis rather than having to attend every meeting. So I'm going to move us on to the final section. It's amazing how quickly our hour is moving. And I want to just offer you some thoughts about case processes. I think the teams that are doing the best job seem to have consistent and streamlined processes for reviewing cases. Often that means that the case coordinator vets matters that are coming before the team and that they have a streamlined way of presenting cases that's used across the board. There is also consensus about what does the team do? And 2 flavors of consensus are that the team develops a shared action plan of very specific steps, that member A is going to do this and member B agrees to do this. But another way teams have functioned is for the presenting agency to say, we're just struggling, get recommendations from the people at the table of ways to go forward, which then include things like, we'd be happy to help, or we could do this through our agency. But it's up to the presenting agency to say, yes, I like that idea, or no, I don't think it'll work. And then finally, I just need to spend a moment, and maybe it's because it appeals to my sense of humor, about having a way of talking across disciplines. And I call it worldview versus need to know. Some of you are smiling, you already know where I'm going. But one team that I was invited to visit some years ago was having a hard time keeping its medical personnel. And they would be fidgeting, they'd be watching the clock, checking emails, doing a variety of things that had nothing to do with the case. And the reason they were doing that is some people in the room looked at this as an opportunity to share what they thought was important to know. But their important to know was because of how they were trained and what was important for them in their professional role. And put more directly, what a social worker needs to know is different from what a police officer needs to know. And that's certainly different from what a doctor needs to know. And so there is a way, when all of those are represented on your team, to reduce the amount of information that is shared to that which is critical to know for everybody. You will kill your team when you don't have some way of clarifying and streamlining. And if anyone after this call wants to talk with me about that, just let me know. You will have my email. I think you also just need to be mindful about confidentiality at a multitude of levels. It's not just simply on the team and within the team, but it is within agencies, and it's also within systems. And then finally, think about processes, sort of the boring and didactic. Do you have a regular meeting time? Do you have an agreed upon length of time you meet? All day meetings will kill everybody. Keep them short, keep them sharp. Have an agreed upon time that you spend on individual cases, so cases aren't discussed to the point where people are losing all interest. And once again, if anyone wants to jump in, this is your chance. Shelley, or I'm sorry, Lisa, are you seeing anything?
Nope, I did put a link. I know we're not finishing yet, but just going to give a plug. I did put a link to the evaluation survey in the chat. If people would please fill that out before you log off, that'd be great.
And so I'm going to quickly summarize because I too have a clock. So I'm mindful of and respectful of your times. So think about a way to vet cases and prepare, as I've already suggested. A case review form is really helpful to summarize what the case is about. It doesn't need to have names or specifics, but just general information. Think about, can you make meetings more user-friendly? And this is one place where COVID may have given us some new pathways. One of the things several teams told me is in COVID, they've actually had greater engagement of team members because it's reduced travel time. And agencies that could be an hour and a half or 2 hours away weren't coming to the meetings. They just didn't have 4 hours to share an hour meeting on. But they could spend the hour of the meeting online on a platform. And so think about, is this something that you may want to use either all the time or occasionally as a way to engage? Think about how often you meet and don't feel you have to meet constantly. Some teams have an emergency process for meetings to meet if a case comes in that requires immediate review between meetings, and that can be really, really useful. And then my final word is people have to know you exist. And it's not simply your members, but agencies and entities in your community that could be feeding cases to members of your MDT. Think outside the obvious, community CCR or task force or fatality review or fiduciary abuse team. Think about teams that may be addressing domestic violence or mental health or homelessness or veterans, because they are seeing overlapping cases. Be prepared to make presentations to them and or provide training to them. And think about, and some of you are going to moan because you say, oh, there's so much work. Think about the benefits of an annual report. And think about how you disseminate it to community leaders like your funding agency, if you're responsible to a board of supervisors or county aldermen, as well as getting it into the press. That will help start to identify additional cases. So I have added a few resources, and I believe you will be getting these in a separate handout in any case. And on that note, we have actually ended when we're supposed to, but I'm happy to stay on for any final questions or ideas and to give you a chance to add your final comments.
Brenda had to jump to another meeting. Rebecca is saying very helpful. Thank you, Candace.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for jumping in, sharing ideas, participating in my survey months ago, and for just doing the work you do, because communities really are better because of the work of your teams. Take care, everybody. See you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank y'all.
Bye-bye.